you. I'm going to speak today mainly on the INF compliance issues, but you have to realize that that's just really a very small portion of what the Russians are doing in contravention of existing arms control treaties. It's a very extensive program of noncompliance. I don't have time today to get into it. If any of you are interested in the broader picture, I have a 2012 article in Comparative Strategy, which deals with a wide range of nuclear-related arms control compliance issues, and also my monograph on New START, which is available on the National Institute website. It's entitled New START, The Anatomy of a Failed Negotiation. It has a full chapter, chapter 4, on the broad range of compliance issues. Now, the INF Treaty was, in many respects, a landmark arms control agreement in that we actually got what we set out to get, whether it was a good idea or a bad idea. We got the so-called zero option, which completely eliminated, or was supposed to have eliminated, intermediate range, ground-launched missiles of both cruise and ballistic types. It banned the production, the testing, the possession of these missiles, and mandated that all existing missiles had to be eliminated in a 3-year period. It also had the first extensive on-site inspection regime. Now, while I'm calling it a landmark treaty, that's not to say it didn't have some warts. It certainly did. Frank Gaffney, for example, was very critical of the treaty and opposed its ratification. And from our perspective today, it increasingly looks like he was very accurate in his perception of what is going on. Now, in January, late January 2014, the New York Times ran an article by Michael Gordon, which reported that the United States had just briefed our NATO allies on a Russian violation of the INF Treaty involving the testing of a long-range cruise missile. The article stated that we raised the issue in May of 2013. That it quoted administration officials as saying, quote, "There was no question that the missile tests ran counter to the treaty." And then amazingly, the next day, the State Department fully confirmed the story. And that was rather shocking to me because I think the nicest thing you can say about their overall policy on arms control compliance is that it's weak. Now, immediately after the story appeared, 3 House committee chairmen, Buck McKeon, Mike Rogers, and Ed Royce, wrote a letter to the president saying this was a material breach of the INF Treaty and the evidence was compelling. Just after that, a few days after that, Brian McKeon, who is the staff director, or time anyway, was staff director of the National Security Council, testified in front of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and he said that it appears that the Russians were taking action that was inconsistent with the INF Treaty. We raised it with them. They gave us an answer. We don't regard that answer as adequate, and the issue was still on the table. The cruise missile in question is almost certainly the R-500. The Russians announced the first test of this missile in the middle of 2007. The then First Deputy Prime Minister, Colonel General Sergei Ivanov, who is now Kremlin Chief of Staff, and prior to that was the defense minister, said that, quote, "It can be used at long range with surgical precision," as the doctors say. Now, that's a very odd thing to say about a missile that's supposed to be ultra short range, under 500 kilometers in range, but it appears consistent with very extensive Russian press reporting on this missile, starting in 2008 and continuing through the end of 2013. Major Russian publications, such as RIA Novosti, which is an official news agency, Kommersant, a major business publication, Interfax, a main unofficial news agency, Pravda RU, and a number of others have reported that the actual range of the R-500 was 1,000 to 3,200 kilometers, which is 2 to 6 times what's permissible under the INF treaty. Interfax reported that the missile was actually in serial production in 2012. There are Russian reports that the actual missile itself is a modernization of the cruise missile, which was specifically by name eliminated under the INF treaty. And when you look at the released Russian photographs of the first launch and you compare it to the INF treaty memorandum of understanding photographs of the Russian treaty impacted Glick'em, they look like the same missile, and they certainly look too big to be a less than 500 kilometer missile. Now, the R-500 is not in any respect the only Russian issue of compliance with the INF treaty. We have 5 issues right now being discussed in the Russian media. This includes the RS-26 missile, which they call an ICBM. I've characterized as a IRBM masquerading as an ICBM. The range of the Iskander-M, which is a tactical ballistic missile. The retention of the Skoros IRBM, that's a late Soviet era missile with a reported range of 4,000 kilometers, so it's in the prohibited range, and giving surface to air missiles and ABM interceptor missiles, which have nuclear capability, by the way, the ability to strike ground targets. Now, the RS-26, I think, is probably a circumvention rather than a legal violation of the treaty. And I'm using the word violation to mean there's a clear indication that the activity in question is specifically contrary to the treaty. A circumvention is a action by Russia which is intended and actually produces prohibited capabilities, but by exploiting loopholes in the INF or the New START treaty. So we have a situation where starting in September 2011, the Russians began testing a missile they characterized as a new ICBM. It has a very strange testing program. They claim the first test went to 5,600 kilometers, which, if true, would make it just barely an ICBM under the STAR or the New STAR treaty. The RS-26 is clearly not a normal ICBM in that it clearly doesn't have enough range to perform a real ICBM mission. It is generally referred to in the Russian, or not generally, but it has been referred to a number of well-known Russians, analysts, as a, quote, reduced range ICBM. According to NASIC, that's Air Force Intelligence, the range of the missile is 5,500 plus kilometers. That compares with their estimated range of every other Russian ICBM from 9,000 plus to 11,000 kilometers. Now, there's still a possibility, if I'm calling it a circumvention because I think that's the most likely, but there's still a possibility that it violates either the INF treaty or the New STAR treaty if some of the Russian press reports are correct. Now, the arms control enthusiast community has been saying, well, what does this matter because, well, it's going to be constrained by the New STAR treaty. Perhaps right now it is, but the Russians have announced the development of a rail-mobile ICBM. They're clearly going ahead with this program, and by some strange coincidence, the New START Treaty doesn't mention rail-mobile ICBMs. Every definition that existed in the old START Treaty that covered rail mobiles and brought them into the treaty, all the language from the articles of the treaty that dealt with rail mobile ICBMs are simply not in the New START Treaty. So absent the treaty amendment, this system's going to run free, and the Russians will never agree to a treaty amendment. Now, very recently, within the last month or so, a major Russian publication said that they're thinking about changing the missile on the top of the rail mobile launcher. And guess which one it is? The RS-26. So in effect, we may have a cruise missile, which is overt violation of the treaty, and a ballistic missile that will cover the entire INF range spectrum, probably not an actual violation, but a massive circumvention of the treaty. And somehow or another, I don't believe we negotiated the INF treaty to substitute a 5,600 kilometer range RS-26 for a 5,000 kilometer range SS-20. And that's really the situation we've got ourselves into. Now, in September 2011, a Russian trade publication published an article about a request for proposals the space agency, Russian Space Agency, had made about the elimination of ICBMs and SLBMs. Problem with this was that the article noted that one of the, quote, ICBMs, unquote, wasn't an ICBM. It was the Skoros missile, which reportedly has a 4,000 kilometer range, which puts it in the middle of the INF treaty prohibited zone. And oh, by the way, it had an ICBM in it, which doesn't appear in the START Treaty, MOU, which lists all the accountable objects or missiles under the treaty. So here is another example of what the Russians are doing fast and loose in relation to existing treaties. Now, beyond that, we have the issue of whether or not Russian surface-to-air missiles and ABM interceptors, which are nuclear armed. There's a load of evidence of that. According to Pavel Felgengauer, who's one of the most distinguished journalists writing in Russia today on the issues relating to defense and foreign policy, all of the modern surface-to-air missiles and the Moscow ABM system are not only nuclear armed, but have a secondary surface-to-surface attack role. If that's true, that's a clear violation of the INF treaty. So you take all these issues, and yeah, I don't think I mentioned this one. There's also the Iskander-M system. It's reported in the Russian press to have a 600 to 1,000 kilometer range, which puts it in the INF prohibited area. I suspect that this is a circumvention of the treaty. But you put all these issues together, you basically, the INF treaty goes away as any significant constraint on what the Russians are doing. Now, how has the administration handled this problem? Well, according to Brian McKeon, the NSC, we knew about this early enough to inform the Senate about the INF issue, and he also said a potential New START violation, which we don't know what that's about, but I suspect that it's one of the issues I talked about here. We have a situation in which the administration has essentially been feeding the American people disinformation on Russian compliance. Now, if you take a look at the last 3 compliance reports issued by the Obama administration, you turn to the INF section, it creates the impression that there's no problems. It says we haven't had an SVC session, which is the INF compliance form since October 2013. And we have raised no issues during the reporting period. Now, that's technically true, but the 2013 report came out 2 months after the New York Times says we raised this cruise missile issue with the Russians. So while technically true, it's clearly misleading, and I think it's intentionally misleading. Now, the administration hasn't formally decided the cruise missile is a violation of the INF treaty, despite the fact it doesn't appear to be any issues to resolve. If it's the R-500, it's clearly a ground-launched cruise missile. I mean, that's what the Russians have said. That's what the pictures show. So there doesn't appear to be any legal issues associated with it. According to an exchange in front of the Senate Armed Services Committee with Brian McKeon and Senator Weicker sort of dueling it out on this issue, we had just provided the Senate Armed Services Committee a code word letter, top secret code word letter on this issue, the cruise missile issue. And it's pretty clear that they obviously have sensitive intelligence to support. It's not only the open source Russian literature. It's a lot more than that, and yet there hasn't been any decision, despite the fact that the New York Times says we were sure about this in 2011. So where are we on this broader arms control situation? We're in a bad situation because the treaty is rapidly becoming a dead letter. We have a Russian Federation, which is at this very moment having military exercises threatening an invasion of the Ukraine. We have a Russian Federation with a military doctrine that calls for the use of nuclear weapons in local and regional conflicts. Now, the current commanding general of NATO military organization, General Breedlove, says we have to do something about this. We can't just ignore a INF treaty violation. I hope he's right, but I don't have a lot of faith right now that the administration is going to do anything at all other than essentially filibuster this issue with the Russians. I would note that about 2 weeks after the Times story happened and the administration had confirmed the apparent violation of the INF treaty, the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security delivered a speech on the future of arms control. Well, she didn't mention any compliance issue in general or the INF treaty in particular. Now, I think that sends a fairly clear message about which way the administration, what it's likely to actually do in the foreseeable future. Thank you. The withdrawal clause, which is a standard feature of all arms control negotiations, doesn't come into play when you're dealing with a material breach of the treaty. Material breach alone under international law allows you to suspend the treaty in whole or in part. The withdrawal clause relates to reasons that are unrelated to compliance. For example, the enormous change in circumstances since the INF treaty was concluded in 1988. We have a situation where there's been enormous proliferation of intermediate range, medium intermediate range ballistic missile capability around the world. That certainly wasn't taken into account when we negotiated the INF treaty. A very changed circumstance there, which even completely divorced from the issue of compliance would create the legal opportunity to pull out of this treaty. But when you put it in the context of of compliance, I think the case is pretty overwhelming. I mean, there's nothing left of the INF treaty if the Russians are doing these things. It had a verification regime, but that died in its entirety over a decade ago. So there is really nothing that we get out of the INF treaty anymore that could in any reasonable way create a case to continue the observation of a treaty which is being, I mean, seriously violated by the other party, the Russians.
Other questions for Dr. Schneider? Yes, Joel.
Imagine we had a president who was interested in leadership. What would you recommend would be effective steps other than suspending or abrogating the treaty?
Well, it depends on what your objective is. Do you want to preserve the INF treaty, or do you want to maximize your nuclear deterrent? If you either way, terminating the existing treaty is likely to be in our interests. If you want to preserve the INF treaty, you got to do exactly what the Reagan administration did, which was create a threat to the Russians that they regard as more serious than the value of cheating on the treaty. And the reason we got the INF treaty to begin with was the dual track approach, where we deployed Pershing II ballistic missiles and cruise missiles in Europe. I mean, the Russians tried to abort that program. They walked out of the arms control negotiations in 2003. The only reason ultimately they signed up for the zero option, because thank God for Russian paranoia, they thought that the Pershing II had enough range to reach Moscow, which it didn't, and it was deliberately designed to be unable to reach Moscow. We had an earth penetrator warhead that was developed for the missile. Now, we never deployed it. It was in fact developed and then the decision made not to deploy it. But from a paranoid Russian standpoint, they could see the deep underground bunkers at Moscow going up or being collapsed, in effect. And I think that's the main reason why they went along with the zero option. Now, there was one other factor which I think had a big impact, was that for the first time, and literally the only time in the history of arms control, the Reagan administration actually imposed a serious penalty for a treaty violation. It terminated U.S. compliance with two existing agreements, SALT I interim agreement and SALT II. And this scared the Russians really, really badly. And that's why they shifted, my view anyway, their position on the INF treaty. The paranoia about the Pershing II, plus a real shot across the bow on arms control compliance, was enough to get them to change their position. Now, quite probably, in light of what we now know, they had planned to cheat all along, and that was taken into account. But if I had one recommendation to make, it would be even a token number of Pershing IIs being deployed in Europe would shake the Russians up and change a lot of their attitudes in a very positive way.
Other questions for Dr. Schneider? Yep, Admiral.
Got to get that right. Mark, one of the things I'd do immediately is put our TNF back on our nuclear submarines, which would have an impact both on Korea and the Russians. But in light of the cheating on INF, what was behind this dramatic announcement we made on a significant reduction to our strategic nuclear forces in 4 years ahead of the required date on the New START treaty?
What was behind it? Arms control enthusiasm on the part of this administration, and a lack of seriousness on the general compliance issues. They don't take this stuff seriously. I mean, the nicest thing I could say about their compliance policy, it's the weakest we've had since the 1970s. If I want to be more honest, you know, I could talk words like fraud and deception of the American people, about the status quo with regard to compliance. You take a look at the judgments they have made about Russian compliance, you see two things. They provide virtually no information about what's actually going on, and what they do say is frequently very cleverly worded and misleading. And then on important topics, I think, like the Biological Weapons Convention and the Chemical Weapons Convention, they've watered down judgments that have been made in the case of the Biological Convention by every administration since Ronald Reagan, including the Clinton administration. And I don't know of any information that would justify these changes in our position on the extent of Russian noncompliance.